whether or not there were other people or other senior leaders within Russia's military that considered jumping aboard this Prigozhin mutiny.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, we've had a lot of activity in Russia, and the mercenaries who'd been a pretty big part of the Russian war effort in Ukraine are revolting. Now, people have found them revolting in the past, but this time, literally, there was an incident between them and Russian President Vladimir Putin's government. What is the status of things right now?
So the main players in this whole situation are the Wagner Group, its founder Yevgeny Prigozhin, as well as top Russian defense leaders Sergei Shoigu, General Gerasimov, as well as obviously President Putin.
Right.
And so Prigozhin and his Wagner forces have led the fight in Ukraine for months, and they really took control from the Russian military because they had less than ideal success in the first couple of months of the war. Over the last couple of months, we've seen Prigozhin attack top Russian defense leaders pretty aggressively, accusing them of treason, accusing them of withholding aid and resources, military resources, to them on the front lines. But we saw this little, back and forth blow up to, exponential proportions over the last week or so. We saw Prigozhin go on to his Telegram channel, which is how he communicates publicly, and declare that he was going to launch what he called a March for Justice, where he would take his troops from Ukraine and march them to Moscow. And we heard through additional reporting that it was his intention to capture both Shoigu and Gerasimov, but the FSB, Russia's internal intelligence apparatus, gained wind of this plot. And so they were able to thwart it. Overall, however, there was a brief 36 hours where Prigozhin had, urged his troops to march, or directed them to, and they had taken that order. They even occupied a city near the border with Ukraine for a short period of time, which included defense buildings. So this was not a small thing. The troops.
I mean, during this stretch of time, there was some concern within Russia that this could threaten the Putin regime.
Absolutely, and at the time we didn't know exactly what Prigozhin's mission was. We didn't know what his targets were. We didn't know what his goals were, what he was hoping to accomplish. We have a slightly better understanding, but most questions still remain unknown, and we might not know. But so Prigozhin and his troops got to within about 120 miles of Moscow, and they really didn't face much resistance doing it, even though we've heard Russian authorities knew ahead of time. So there is some speculation that this says a lot to Russia's internal capabilities. But that being said, we heard pretty abruptly from the Belarusian government that they had brokered a truce between the parties in which Prigozhin would flee to Belarus and would avoid being charged, even though there's still an investigation ongoing. And so he really did sort of pretty quickly pull back his troops and call off this attack, even though he hadn't faced much resistance. And we've heard a little bit of speculation that a part of this had to do with the fact that while they received a little bit of support as they were marching towards Moscow, there wasn't overwhelming support. A top Russian general is now under investigation, and there are reports that he's been arrested, even though the Kremlin isn't commenting publicly on his disappearance or his status, who the New York Times has reported was aware ahead of time of Prigozhin's plans. Now, it's not quite clear if he wanted to help Prigozhin. It wasn't clear if he was the individual who tipped off Russia's internal authorities. So it's really unclear exactly his role, which side he was on, and whether or not there were other people or other senior leaders within Russia's military that considered jumping aboard this Prigozhin mutiny.
So this would seem to raise a couple of questions, one being Russian unity.
Absolutely.
The unity under Vladimir Putin, and two, what Russia is really going to do in terms of manpower in Ukraine, since they've been heavily reliant on these mercenaries, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And so Prigozhin said during his March for Justice statement that he had, about 25,000 troops under his command that were going on this plot. And so we know that they have a much larger force than that, but at the same time, they have also taken, as you mentioned, significant casualties because they were on the front lines of the battle for Bakhmut, which was the deadliest battle of the war so far that went on for about 8 months. And we heard from U.S. officials that the Russian military as a whole lost about 100,000 casualties in Bakhmut from January to about this time. And so about half of them were Wagner forces. So Wagner has been degraded pretty significantly because of this battle in Bakhmut, but it's because they were on the front lines. And why were they on the front lines is because Prigozhin convinced Putin that his troops would do a better job than the inadequate job that the Russian military had done up to that point. Now, as you mentioned, there are a lot of questions still up in the air because one of the issues that Prigozhin mentioned that led to this whole revolt was that the Russian military wanted to fold the Wagner Group into its own troops. And that's not something that Prigozhin was interested in doing, obviously. And so it's unclear exactly if the Wagner fighters, some of whom are still in Russian-occupied Ukraine, will continue to fight on behalf of Russia, whether they'll officially join the Russian military, and what will happen with the Wagner Group's efforts all across the globe, specifically in Africa.
So finally, in the United States, we're going to see some vacancies on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is a very important part of Pentagon leadership. But Senator Tommy Tuberville, the Republican from Alabama, has been doing holds on Pentagon nominees because of his disagreement with the Pentagon abortion policy. What impact might this have on filling these looming vacancies?
So to back up a little bit, for any Joint Chief of Staff position, they serve about 4-year terms, and it just so happens that 4 of them are coming up and will step down between mid-July and October. One of those has been, and President Biden will appoint a replacement, and generally they'll be confirmed in the Senate. Now, obviously, Senator Tuberville has, gone on this. It's been about 6 months now where he's held firm, preventing all military promotions or nominations from going through. And from DoD's perspective, this raises red flags. This is to them, an operational concern. They believe that this will threaten the readiness of the forces. And part of that is because of the 8 spots on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4 of them, as I mentioned, will be coming up. And the top position, the chairman, has already been selected by President Biden, and it's currently the Joint Chief that represents the Air Force, which would make a 5th out of 8 spots that could face a vacancy in the next couple months. And so in some of these cases, the acting deputy will fill in that position. For example, the Marine Corps has the first opening coming up, but it just so happens that President Biden's selection to lead the Marine Corps is currently the second in command. And even if he's not sworn into his position yet, based on his current role, would fill it in an acting capacity.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.